Welcome back, everyone, to the Deep Dive. Now, today we're going to be looking at someone you might not know, but whose story is pretty disturbing.
Mm.
His name is Harvey Louis Carignan. And what we have here is a ton of articles and research all about this guy. And looks like we're in for quite the journey. A lot of dark territory here.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
Yeah, we're talking troubled beginnings, string of violent crimes, and ultimately the legal battles that put him away for good.
It's a case that really makes you think about just human nature. Like, what makes someone capable of this kind of violence?
Yeah, absolutely. And right off the bat, the sources paint a grim picture of his early life. I mean, just starting with being born to a young, unwed mother,
Oh, wow.
and then constantly shuffled between relatives. He even spent time in reform school.
No kidding.
Yeah, and while he's there, he's diagnosed with childhood chorea and enuresis.
What are those?
Well, basically, we're talking involuntary movements and persistent bedwetting.
So already a really rough childhood.
Definitely not easy.
Hmm.
And I mean, you have to wonder how these early experiences, the instability, the neglect, maybe even trauma, how did all that shape him?
Right. I mean, think about it. A kid facing constant uncertainty, lacking that stable environment. It's no excuse, of course, but it does give you some context, for understanding his behavior later on.
Absolutely. And get this, despite all that he graduates reform school and even enlists in the Army at 18, it's like almost a fresh start.
Yeah, you'd think so, right? A chance to break free from that cycle of hardship.
Exactly. Maybe find some structure.
But then again, for someone like Carignan, maybe predisposed to violence already? Maybe the military just made it worse.
What do you mean?
Well, think about it. The rigid hierarchy, the pressure.
Yeah.
For some people, that environment might actually bring out those aggressive tendencies.
Interesting, because just a year later, in 1949, he commits his first known murder. The attempted rape and murder of 58-year-old Laura Showalter up in Alaska.
Wow.
It's chilling, right? This reminder that violence can just be lurking there waiting for the right trigger.
And this first crime, it really shows you how complicated the legal system can be.
How so?
Well, he was sentenced to death initially, but then they overturn it
Why?
because they said his confession was improperly obtained. Brings up the whole issue of coerced confessions,
Yeah, how do you really determine if it was legit or not? And
Right.
what about justice for the victim?
Exactly.
But he did serve time for a different assault, this one on Christine Norton, 15-year sentence, and even did some time in Alcatraz.
Oh, wow. Alcatraz. I mean, that's a whole other level.
Well-
Notorious for housing the worst of the worst.
Exactly. So, I mean, what happens when you put someone who's already violent into that kind of environment?
Right. It's like, does prison actually rehabilitate people, or does it just make them more hardened criminals?
The prisonization effect.
Yeah, exactly. Like, imagine you're surrounded by people who have done these horrible things.
Right.
To survive, you kind of have to shut down your emotions, become aggressive.
So instead of being a deterrent, prison might have actually made him more violent.
It's possible. And actually what happens next kind of supports that theory.
Uh-oh. So he gets out, and pretty soon after, he's convicted of burglary with his brother.
Oh.
And then there are parole violations. It's
Well,
like he can't escape this pattern of criminal behavior.
And from what I see here, that's when the violence really escalates.
Yeah, it gets much worse.
We have the unsolved murders of Leslie Brock and Kathy Sue Miller in Washington State. Both linked to Carignan, but not enough evidence to charge him.
Yeah, it's frustrating. Even when everyone suspects someone, the burden of proof is just so high, sometimes justice isn't served.
And in Miller's case, the sources say she answered a help wanted ad that Carignan placed.
Oh, wow.
And later she was found raped and beaten to death with a hammer.
God, that's just awful. And so calculated, using a help wanted ad to prey on her vulnerability.
It's horrifying. And you're right, the brutality definitely escalates and his choice of victims becomes more and more deliberate.
Yeah, there's this growing sense of he can get away with anything. A complete lack of empathy. It's truly disturbing.
Which leads to him getting a pretty chilling nickname, the Want Ad Killer. The Want Ad Killer.
Because he targeted women looking for work or rides. Really vulnerable women. And the sources even talk about an attack on Jerry Billings. She was only 13.
13. A hitchhiker.
Yeah, and he assaults her, beats her with a hammer.
God, so he's targeting younger and younger victims. What does that tell us?
Right. What is going on in his mind at this point?
Is it just pure depravity, or is he deliberately choosing people who can't fight back? It's scary how calculated it seems.
Yeah, very premeditated. Chilling.
Absolutely terrifying.
And it just gets worse from there. The sources describe his relationship with Eileen Hunley.
Arlene Hunley.
Yeah, but it ends with her disappearance.
Oh, no.
Yeah, and then they find her body brutally murdered.
So another relationship used as a cover for his crimes.
It seems that way.
Yeah,
And what's really striking here is not just the violence itself, but the fact that he tried to hide her body.
right. So he knows what he's doing. He's trying to avoid getting caught.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Like, as the crimes continue, he's getting better at covering his tracks.
That's pretty disturbing.
It is. And then we have even more attacks. Gwen Burton, Sally Versoy, Diane Flynn.
Wow.
The sources go into detail about these acts of depravity. It's honestly tough to even read about.
Yeah, I can imagine. And then there's Catherine Schultz.
Catherine Schultz, whose body was found in a cornfield,
In a cornfield.
beaten to death with a hammer. Her skull was...
Exploded. I mean, that's just a whole other level of brutality, even for someone who studies violent crime.
And it's this final act that finally leads to his arrest. But it makes you wonder, why did it take so long?
Right. So many lives lost before he's finally stopped. It's frustrating.
It really is. It makes you question, the systems in place. Were they really protecting anyone?
It's a good question. How do we as a society respond to these kinds of crimes? How do we prevent them? And how do we bring the people who commit them to justice?
Big questions. And I guess now we need to talk about the trial itself. The sources mention he entered an insanity plea.
Which, given everything we've learned so far, isn't that surprising.
Right. But then there's also this diagnosis of antisocial personality disorder.
Oh, yeah. That's important to understand. That's often called sociopathy.
So what exactly does that mean?
Well, basically, it means a total disregard for social norms. No empathy, often manipulative and deceitful.
So, like, their moral compass is just broken.
Pretty much, the suffering of others means nothing to them.
That is chilling. But does that mean he wasn't responsible for his actions?
Well, that's the tricky part. A diagnosis like that doesn't automatically mean legal insanity.
Okay. Yeah.
It gives us insight into his mind, helps us understand maybe why he did what he did, that detachment. But it doesn't excuse his actions.
So even if he couldn't feel empathy, he still understood that what he was doing was wrong.
Exactly. And that's what the jury had to decide. Did he know what he was doing? Did he understand the consequences?
And in the end, they found him responsible. So, life in prison. But does that really solve anything?
That's another big question. Imprisonment keeps the public safe, but does it address the root of the problem? Why did he become this way?
Right. Are we just punishing him, or are we actually trying to rehabilitate him?
And there's a growing understanding that we need to do more than just lock people up, focus on mental health treatment, education programs, real rehabilitation.
Makes you think about Carignan's childhood. All the trauma and instability.
Yeah.
What if he'd gotten help back then?
Yeah, what if? Could things have been different? It's impossible to know for sure.
But it shows how important early intervention is.
Yes.
Having resources available for people who are struggling.
Absolutely. If we can identify those risk factors early on, maybe we can prevent some of these tragedies.
And ultimately, that brings us back to Carignan's legacy. This man whose violence spanned decades left behind so much pain and so many questions.
And we can't forget about the victims, their families. They're the ones who truly bear the weight of his actions.
So what do we learn from all of this? From this deep dive into such a disturbing case? What are the big takeaways?
I think the biggest takeaway is the importance of early intervention. If we can identify those risk factors, mental health issues, lack of support, we might be able to stop some people from going down this path.
So basically, if we address those early signs of trouble, maybe some people never become violent criminals in the first place.
Exactly. We need to get better at recognizing those signs, too. The patterns of aggression, the escalating incidents.
Like with Carignan, the fact that his crimes were getting more violent and he was targeting more vulnerable victims, those are pretty clear warning signs.
They are, and that's why awareness and education are so important. The more we understand about violence, the better we can recognize those signs and intervene before it's too late.
And then there's the criminal justice system. It seems like we need to find a way to balance punishment with rehabilitation.
Right. Locking people up without addressing the underlying issues doesn't really solve anything long term.
Exactly. So what are the alternatives?
Well, there's a lot of interest in restorative justice models, focusing on repairing the harm that was done and reintegrating offenders back into society.
So instead of just focusing on punishment, we try to heal and rebuild.
Exactly. It might not work for every case, especially ones with extreme violence, but it's a step towards a more holistic approach, actually trying to fix the problem.
So for our listener who has been with us on this journey through Harvey Carignan's life and crimes, what's the one thing you want them to remember?
I want them to remember that while people are responsible for their actions, there are always other factors at play. Their childhood, their environment, mental health issues. And while we can't excuse what they did, understanding those factors is crucial if we want to prevent future tragedies.
Yeah, it really is complicated. You've got individual choices, but then you've got all these societal factors,
Yeah.
and then the systems we have in place to deal with it all. It's a lot to untangle.
Definitely. And, Carignan's case, as messed up as it is, it makes us look beyond just him and think about the bigger picture.
What do you mean?
Well, like, what are we doing as a society to help those who are vulnerable? How do we create communities where everyone feels safe and respected, where violence isn't the answer? These are the questions we need to be asking ourselves if we want to actually stop this from happening again.
That's a good point.
Yeah.
But where do we even start? I mean, it feels so overwhelming.
I know it's a huge challenge, but I think the key is prevention. Investing in early childhood education, mental health services programs that support people who are at risk. Think about it. If we can give kids a safe and stable environment, address mental health issues right away, build communities where everyone feels valued, maybe we can change the course of their lives, before they head down that dangerous path.
So it's not just a criminal justice problem. It's a public health problem.
Exactly. And we need to treat it that way, like we do with other public health crises.
So more research, more resources, more attention.
Absolutely. We need to understand the root causes of violence. What are the risk factors? What works to prevent it?
It makes sense. And you know what I was thinking about? The media, how they cover these stories.
Oh, yeah.
It's always so sensationalized.
Yeah.
All the gruesome details. But they rarely talk about the why or what we can do about it.
It's a tough one. On one hand, you want to raise awareness, hold people accountable, but you don't want to glorify the violence or desensitize people.
Right, because that could even lead to copycat crimes.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So responsible reporting is key. Focus on the victims. Talk about the societal factors. And most importantly, offer solutions, not just shock value.
So we need to be smarter about what we consume and demand better coverage.
Absolutely. And support organizations that are working to stop violence and help the victims.
Okay, so for our listener who's been with us on this deep dive into Harvey Carignan's life, what's the final takeaway? What do you want them to leave with?
I want them to remember that we all have a role to play. Even small actions can make a difference.
Like
volunteering at a local shelter, speaking out against bullying, even just talking to your friends and family about these issues, creating a culture of empathy and respect. It all starts with us.
See, that's a great point. It's easy to feel helpless when you hear these stories,
Yeah.
but we can all do something to make a difference.
Exactly. We can choose to be part of the solution.
Well said. And on that note, I think we've reached the end of our deep dive.
Yeah, I think we covered a lot today.
You did. And to our listener, thanks for joining us. Until next time, keep those minds curious and those hearts open.